I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Kevin Riehle, Associate Professor at the University of Mississippi Center for Intelligence and Security Studies. Dr. Riehle wrote the book on Russian intelligence, along with the definitive book on Soviet defectors, as well as dozens of papers on Russian espionage, spycraft, military strategy, and Cold War history. Dr. Riehle's career includes over 30 years of experience in intelligence and counterintelligence roles with the Defense Intelligence Agency, U.S. European Command, and the FBI, culminating in the position of Senior Policy Officer at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Dr. Riehle has a BA in Russian Political Science from Brigham Young University, an MS in Strategic Intelligence from the Joint Military Intelligence College, and a PhD in War Studies from King's College London, as well as a diploma from the Command and Staff Program at the U.S. Naval War College. He is also the recipient of numerous awards and honors. So, Kevin, welcome back. Thank you so much for coming back. And I'm talking today with you about Russian intelligence and spycraft. So I wanted to start out by highlighting your book for the audience, Russian Intelligence, a case-based study of Russian services and missions past and present. So that's available on Amazon, and I'm going to put links into that in the YouTube notes as well. Can you tell me a little bit about what led you to write this book and maybe kind of a high-level overview of what's in it?
The book originated basically with the pandemic in the beginning of 2020. I was teaching a course then at the National Intelligence University. And the National Intelligence University, we're at the National Intelligence University, it's possible to teach courses that include both open and secured information. It's in a secured space. And when the pandemic began, like most universities, National Intelligence University shut down for a period of time to figure out how to keep students safe. And we were told, rewrite our courses so that they could be taught in a completely open environment over a video link, a non-secured video link. So I had to rethink my whole course. How can I say this in an open setting? My first thought was, I'm teaching a course on Russian intelligence, and how do you talk about something like that completely openly? Because by its very nature, it's secret. But we were given a couple months to rework the courses. And in those couple of months, I found that there was plenty of information about Russian intelligence, openly available, that covered all of the points that needed to be discussed. And that by moving it into an openly accessible format, I didn't lose anything. And the notes from that course, and the format for that course is what ended up in this book. The book is... it basically describes the structure of Russian intelligence state security services. Who are they? Why do they do what they do? And how do they do it? What's the background and the history, a brief history of how Russian intelligence and state security services ended up where they are today, and what major missions do they perform, and the platforms and methods that they use to accomplish that. So that's the basic structure of the book.
Yeah, well, I highly recommend this book. Again, I've been reading through it, doing research, that as well as your other book, Soviet Defectors, that we'll come to in a few minutes. And,
I can just add one more thing about this book, and that's actually, it is available on Amazon, but it's also available for free download at the National Intelligence Press. So it can be bought, but it can also be downloaded in electronic format for free.
Ah, okay. And I will put links to both versions in there then. So the information density in this book, I mean, it's obvious you have tremendous expertise, and you have put so much information in it. And so when I was going through it, it was like drinking from the fire hose. It's just amazing material. One of the things that stood out was when you talked about different types of Russian intelligence operations. So it's not as simple as spying. You've talked about agents provocateurs, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, as well as disinformation and double agents. Can you tell me a little bit about how these different roles work? Because I think most of us have this Hollywood image, and I definitely want to touch on that later as well.
Russian intelligence services today inherit a long history of variety of operational methods that were well practiced during the Soviet era, but originated, some of them, before that, even before the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The Tsarist era secret police services used a range of methods to identify and to neutralize opponents to, at that point, the Tsar. And so agents provocateurs are people who approach an opponent posing as a like-minded person. They say, I agree with you, and then they propose that the opponent do something to cause physical damage, to do something violent, or to break a law. And then the sending service can publicize that and say, look how violent, look how evil these opponents are, to discredit the opponent publicly. Basically, it's to draw out the opponent, to make them do something that will get themselves in trouble. So the Tsarist era services became quite proficient at that, and the Soviet era services picked that up and then continued with it. And it was a method used throughout the Soviet era, and there have been some incidents published of that same concept being used in the post-Soviet era as well. Agents provocateurs are similar to double agents. Double agents are basically someone who's dispatched covertly to the opponent to make them think that they have recruited this person, that they think it's their bona fide recruited agent, when in reality it's someone that we control, that the other side controls. So one side thinks they're in control, the other side really is in control. And that's often used for counterintelligence purposes, in order for one side to identify the intelligence officers of the other, and to sometimes also to insert disinformation into the victim agency. Disinformation then is basically false information or manipulated information to make one side look good and the other side look bad, or to make one side go off in a direction that helps the other side, not even realizing they're doing it. And all of these methods became common during the Soviet era, both inside and outside the Soviet Union, and then continue today.
Well, another thing that you talked about in the book, and I think that this is something that many of us are aware of, but it's easy to forget, is that the KGB, the old Soviet intelligence organization, was just as involved in protecting the Communist Party from internal threats as well as foreign powers. And so does this dual-facing role currently extend to the modern intelligence bureaus as well?
That same mindset exists today as it did during the Soviet era. It's something that in my book I call the Checkist Mindset. And that basically means that the state security services are always looking for threats, and they always then find them, whether real or imagined. Threats might come from inside Russia, and that often means from opposition to the ruling regime or internal sabotage. During the Soviet era, the Soviet KGB had a concept called wrecking, which basically meant that a person was intentionally damaging the Soviet system. But what in reality it usually meant is that they may not have been actively acting to advance the ruling regime's political or economic or industrial plans. That if they weren't actively moving those forward, that they were considered treasonous. Threats from abroad come from any country also that opposes the Russian regime's policies, especially NATO countries. And the defining aspect of that Checkist mindset is that those threats are invariably connected with each other. Wherever there's an internal opposition, the Checkist mindset always sees an external hand behind it. Hence, when media or research organizations don't toe the regime line, in today's Russia, they are labeled foreign agents. So there must be a foreign hand behind them because they're not advancing the regime's line. Whenever threats come from abroad, the assumption is that foreign enemies are trying to destroy Russian society and working with people inside to wreck the system. So that Checkist mindset is that crossover between the external and the internal threats always seeing them as existing.
Ah, well, so another thing that I wanted to ask about, and this is something that I'm not that familiar with, but I know in the United States and China, there are actually many organizations involved with intelligence collection and spycraft. Is Russia similar to that? Are there several different groups involved with this, or is it really predominantly focused on, I guess it would have been the old KGB and now FSB?
There are several organizations, several of them derive from the old Soviet era KGB. The most prominent is the Federal Security Service, or the FSB, which is often called the successor of the KGB. And to a great extent, it inherited many of the functions that the old KGB had. Those particularly include counterintelligence within Russia, which was a major function of the KGB, but then also intelligence activities within the former Soviet space. So the FSB is responsible for intelligence activities in the portion of the world that used to fall within the Soviet Union. But there are also two other services that trace their existence to the KGB. One of them is the Foreign Intelligence Service, or the SVR, and as the name implies, it conducts foreign intelligence activities. It was formed just as the Soviet Union was dissolving in 1991 and has remained consistent since then. It was the service that ran illegals, intelligence illegals, who were arrested in the United States in 2010. It's also a service that was found behind some hacking activities in the United States in 2021, 2022. The third service that derives from the KGB is less known, and that's called the Federal Protective Service, or the FSO. And that's responsible primarily for protecting Russian leadership, similar to what the US Secret Service does, but it also protects sensitive government communications within Russia. And it also collects information inside Russia to understand what the general, to gauge the opinion of Russian citizens around the country. And that's part of protecting the presidential regime, is understanding where Russians stand on various issues. An FSO special communications officer named Mikhail Zhilin was recently in the news. Really, for almost the first time, an FSO officer defected. He crossed the border from Russia to Kazakhstan in protest to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately for that FSO officer, the Kazakhstani government handed him back to Russia, likely to face severe punishment because he had access to sensitive information. One other Russian intelligence service is the main intelligence director of the General Staff, or the GRU, or it's been officially called in Russia for the past decade or so, the GU. The actual R in that acronym is the word for intelligence. And about 10 or so years ago, that R was removed, and it's now called the main directorate officially, although everyone still calls it the GRU in conversation. It is Russia's military intelligence and covert action service. And it's become prominent in the past decade or so for its intelligence, assassination, and sabotage operations, especially across Europe. And it remains from the Soviet era, and it's been very active in Ukraine, collecting targeting information and conducting sabotage operations.
Yeah. Well, now you've mentioned operations in various countries, right? And it should be no surprise that intelligence organizations, not just Russia, but most intelligence organizations operate all over the globe. So what I'm wondering is, from what I understand at least, in the case of something like China, they rely heavily on, from what I understand, bribery and extortion, especially tied to cultural identity, as well as honeypots, corporate espionage, and then some technical surveillance. Does Russia tend to favor different methods, or is it more along the lines of they just kind of go with what works?
Russia uses whatever method works. They collect intelligence both inside Russia, but against those oppositionists and against potential spies within the former Soviet space and then further abroad. They include human methods like exploiting personal vulnerabilities like a honeypot would do, to technical methods, to signals intelligence, to imagery intelligence, to collecting internet communications traffic. Exploiting a human vulnerability, like using a honeypot, is just the beginning of an operation, really. it's how an individual gets caught up in espionage. After that, the individual has to be handled, and the information has to be received and then communicated back to headquarters. And that initial recruitment is just one thing, but how well the person continues to cooperate after having been recruited is really the measure of a solid intelligence service. So sometimes those coercive recruitments work, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes less coercive recruitment methods are more effective because they find someone who is more willing to cooperate. The strange thing, though, is that Russian operations keep getting caught across North America and Europe. Many people have been arrested, sometimes after a short time, sometimes after operating for several years. Just about a month ago, an individual who worked for Germany's intelligence service, the BND, was arrested for spying for Russia. It's not clear from the publicly available information what method was used to recruit him or how long he'd operated. But in the past year, nearly 500 Russian officials have been expelled from Russian embassies, particularly in Europe. That shows that those countries knew quite a lot about the identities of Russian officers. And they were able to, when they wanted to protest Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to identify those officers and to, by name, expel them. So Russian actions are frequently made public and sometimes come back to bite Russia.
Well, the reason I'd asked about that was, and again, this goes back to some of the interviews I'd done with, Dr. Nick Eftimides. When he had talked about Chinese espionage, one of the things he talked about was bribery was relied on heavily by the Chinese. But then another aspect of it, and again, this goes to cultural identity, Chinese scientists, students, officials of that kind were often extorted. Their families in China would be threatened, right? And that puts them in this precarious position that leads them, as you mentioned, it leads them into espionage. So I was wondering if Russia relied on a lot of those similar techniques. But
I can speak more for the Soviet era. Historically, if an individual was allowed to travel outside the Soviet Union, they were usually required to leave their family members in the Soviet Union. And that was to some extent a form of extortion, to say, you better not go out of line, because if you do, you still have family members back home who can be affected by this. And that was often the case with defectors, people who decided to leave the country, but to leave their family members behind. And the Soviet policy was that if an individual defected, that their family would suffer for it legally, based upon law, not just artificially, but they would literally be able to take away all of the possessions of family members of a defector. And it was to a great extent a deterrence for people to defect. Say, if I defect, I know it's going to harm my family members, so I have to be very careful. It doesn't mean defection ended, just meant that the Soviet Union, in a legal sense, had a lever over anyone who left the country.
Yeah. Well, and that brings us to Soviet defectors. And again, you have written a lengthy book, and again, an amazing book entitled Soviet Defectors, Revelations of Renegade Intelligence Officers, 1924 to 1954. So the focus was a little bit older there, but I think as you've said, many of the techniques kind of move forward over time, right? So I guess I should ask, in the case of that, have there been any massive surprises that we've learned about through defection? Like penetrations where it was just like, oh my God, we had no idea that they knew this much.
There have definitely been penetrations that defectors have revealed. And sometimes those led to not mass arrests, but arrests in the West or in the penetrated country, because we didn't know they had existed until a defector told us. It's particularly so intelligence officer defectors offered a window into the closed thinking of the Soviet Union's national security system. There were many defectors during the Soviet era. Defection was a significant problem for the Soviets, but intelligence officer defectors were different from others like sportsmen or dancers or merchant marines or journalists, because intelligence officers had special access to information. And that provided insights into what the Soviet leadership was thinking about threats in the world and how the Soviet leadership was planning to address those threats. And sometimes that did provide some very useful information for Western national security thinkers as well. One thing my book points out is that immediately following World War II, there was a sudden flow of Soviet intelligence officers who defected, mostly to the US and British occupation forces in Germany and Austria. There's not as much known about these particular individuals because they were handled very quietly by US and Great Britain, but they showed a Soviet state security system that was quickly transitioning from fighting Nazis in the war to fighting its own citizens, who it viewed as threats to the Stalinist regime, and also fighting a new Cold War against the Soviet Union's former wartime allies. So that was something we probably didn't anticipate, but we learned pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, and I think, in the decade following World War II, that brought us to McCarthyism and the Red Scare in the 50s. And, I'll be the first to admit that McCarthy was a demagogue and he liked to bully people with unfounded accusations. But it seems like he was also playing on an existing general public anxiety about Russian spies infiltrating government, Hollywood, and higher education. Now, do you think that we were actually compromised back then? I mean, to some degree, like he'd said, was there any truth at all to the Red Scare allegations, or was that just something that was just anxiety and panic?
There were definitely Soviet spies active in the United States during the 40s and 50s. And one of the reasons for spy media of the 1950s, one of the reasons that was even possible was that there was a steady stream of real espionage cases, expulsions of Soviet intelligence officers and Soviet defectors publicized in the press. Between 1946 and 1954, the United States expelled at least 9 Soviet officers from who were operating under diplomatic cover in the United States. There were several major defection cases in 1953 and 1954 that received broad press coverage, like Pyotr Deryabin in Austria, Yuri Rastvorov in Japan, and the Petrovs in Australia. But while there were real espionage cases and while there was real espionage happening, McCarthy didn't have access to accurate information about that. He exploited the real events for his own political benefit and then expanded them to include people who were totally uninvolved. And so he politicized what was an already existing situation. And there's frankly a tendency to do that in the United States today, to politicize espionage for domestic purposes too.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that intrigues me about that era is on a cultural level, it set so many things that we kind of take for granted today. For instance, from what I've read, zombie movies, many alien movies, things along those lines, they're not actually about zombies. They're not actually about aliens. They were about the Red Scare. It was the fear of outsiders. It could be anyone. It could be your next door neighbor, right? I believe Body Snatchers was one of the best examples, of that.
Well, and even silly things like Boris and Natasha in the Bullwinkle cartoons. There was so many Cold War cultural images on both sides. The Cold War divide, actually, there were Cold War cultural images in the Soviet side too, that showed the Americans as the evil in the world, and so that cultural representation was kept those images very close to the surface in people's minds.
Now, another thing, and again, you talked about agents provocateurs, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly this time, who've been covertly dispatched. And, moving from the 50s into the 60s, they covertly cause unrest or physical damage. Do you think that Lee Harvey Oswald could have been one of those? The thing that I've always wondered about that the press never seemed to publicize was He lived in Russia for a year. And I mean, this was during the height of the Cold War. He came back with a Russian wife. And from what I've read, historically speaking, they'd said that he'd gone there because he was fed up with the United States. He thought he would find a better life in Russia, and it turns out he didn't. So he became disenchanted. But I'm not sure if anybody knows what actually happened when he lived there, and I've always wondered.
Well, obviously a very controversial topic, one that is still the subject of a lot of conspiracy theories. But I've done some research in the now declassified data about Oswald and several related defector cases. My research has been focused specifically on the defectors, but Oswald features into several of those. Oswald was one of the Americans who did defect to the Soviet Union in the 1950s. There were a number, but he did decide to return to the United States a few years later. There were several other U.S. defectors who made a similar choice about the same time, who defected to the Soviet Union and then came back after being disenchanted. But in all that data, there is no reliable information that Oswald was a Soviet agent after his return to the United States. He was an unhinged individual.
Yeah.
Even the Soviet Union recognized that. There's a lot of question about how he was handled when he was in the Soviet Union. The KGB actually saw him as a hot potato to some extent. He tried to commit suicide several times while he was in the Soviet Union, and the KGB basically said, "We want nothing to do with this guy." So there is no reliable data that Oswald was a tool of the Soviet Union.
Interesting. Well, thank you for clarifying that. And again, I didn't know that last part. I think it helps to understand the intricacies of the history, right? And so it's wonderful that you've done research on this. Now, in addition to, and the reason I'd asked about Oswald was, in addition to collecting intelligence and fomenting general unrest, my understanding is that Russian intelligence has also been involved in assassinations, at least in the past. The one that comes to mind is the polonium poisoning of the former FSB operative Alexander Litvinenko in 2006. My apologies for not pronouncing that right.
As I tell my students, I don't grade people on their pronunciation of Russian names.
Yeah. Now, in the case of Alexander Litvinenko, was that actually was that an assassination by Russian intelligence, or was that, I understand the Russian mafia was involved. There could be potentially many other factors there.
The British investigation into that case found that it was, in fact, a Russian government-sponsored event. Russian intelligence services have definitely been involved in assassinations, including Litvinenko in 2006, but also Sergei Skripal in 2018 in the UK. Even more frequent than these, however, is the Russian government sponsorship of assassinations of over 20 Chechen militants around the world, as well as assassinations of Ukrainian military officials even before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Russia's also conducted assassination operations against anti-Putin oppositionists inside Russia, including Boris Nemtsov in 2015 and Alexei Navalny in 2020. Russian assassination operations don't always succeed. Skripal and Navalny are both still alive, despite having been the targets of assassinations. And that was the case during the Cold War as well, when several assassination targets survived their assassination attempts. There are three types of Russian assassination targets. One that the Russian services consider to be military targets, like Chechens or Ukrainians. Those are military-related, security-related targets. Then there are political targets, like Nemtsov and Navalny. And there are traitors, like Litvinenko and Skripal. In 2006, the Russian State Duma passed a law making it lawful to deprive the life of a person who is involved in terrorism. Basically, you're allowed to kill somebody, even abroad, if the person is involved in terrorism. And Russian law enforcement organizations often use terrorism laws against opposition activists. That then makes them the subject of having, in the language of that law, their life deprived. So assassinations are a legal method within Russia.
Okay. Well, and then I guess that brings me really, we're getting towards the end of our question list, but I wanted to touch on Havana syndrome. And, this was something that I recently covered, in another interview. It's been suggested that this may have originated with radar flooding or EM technical surveillance by Russian intelligence. And, perhaps it's still ongoing. Maybe it's a side effect of an intelligence collection method. And then it's also been suggested that they may have realized they could use this for other purposes. And so it may be used, only to cause mild physical injury as it does. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that there's any connection with them?
I can't go much more. I don't know much more about this topic than is in the media. So, and then the media is widely divided on the topic. So
Yeah.
I can't give any definitiveness to it, but it would be an extraordinarily aggressive act if the Russian intelligence service was behind the Havana syndrome. It would be a departure from traditional restraint that intelligence services pose on themselves to avoid physically harming their counterparts. If it can be proven conclusively, which it has not at this point been, but if it can be that the action was perpetrated by a Russian intelligence service, it would be well beyond the pale. I mean, it would be well beyond any accepted behavior of an intelligence service. So again, I'm not going to take a side on it, but it would be very serious.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. And one of the things that I'd wondered is the technology for that is not new, and so it's possible that there are plenty of other actors in the world if it's being used to cause injury. If that's in fact what's going on, there are plenty of other actors that could have picked that technology up along the way. But
Certainly.
yeah, I definitely wanted to ask about it. And so I guess as a final question, I wanted to ask about Russian influence in American elections. And as you've mentioned, this is used for partisan reasons. This is something that gets thrown around. Is there firm evidence of this, or is this just partisan rhetoric?
There is good evidence that Russia has attempted to influence U.S. politics. And the strongest evidence for that is from the 2016 U.S. presidential elections. But other attempts have also been made, and beyond just the United States, there's further evidence that Russian intelligence services have attempted to manipulate politics in France, Spain, the UK, Montenegro, Austria, and other particularly European countries, but other countries around the world as well. But I would make a difference, though, between attempting to manipulate and actually having an effect. The effect is nearly impossible to measure. In the 2016 U.S. presidential elections, legitimate U.S. political parties spent over 600 times as much money as the Russians did in their manipulation attempts. And that U.S. legitimate money was often spent on divisive political campaign ads. The U.S. political environment is widely divided, absent any Russian attempts to manipulate U.S. political opinion. Russia didn't create that division. I would give my opinion, and there will be some who strongly disagree with this, but I would say that statements that Russia is on the verge of destroying the U.S. democracy or any other country's democracies are exaggerated.
Yeah.
Only those countries themselves could do that. So, yes, Russia tries. Russia has been involved in election manipulation activities since its existence, since the Soviet Union began to exist. There's been some very good research about Russian manipulation or attempts to manipulate elections in the 1970s and 80s in the United States, for example. There's a very good book by a professor named Thomas Rid called Active Measures that talks about Soviet manipulation of German elections. That's not a new thing. The question really is, how much difference do they make? And that's hard to figure.
Absolutely. Kevin, let me thank you again so much for your time today and for joining me a second time to discuss Russian intelligence and Soviet defectors. Again, I'm going to put links to the books and I will put links to your website in as well. I'll put all these in the YouTube show notes. Let me close by asking, where do you think that we're likely to see Russian intelligence in the headlines in the near future? It seems like this is a very interesting time because of the Ukraine war. And I'm sure that that has all sorts of repercussions and effects on the Russian intelligence services. Do you think that that's where we're likely to see them next in that context?
Russia, as with any country, uses its intelligence capability to answer its highest priority national security concerns. Right now, probably the highest priority concerns for Russia are circumventing sanctions, understanding the political and military support by Western countries to Ukraine, then also understanding the internal Western reaction to Russia's nuclear saber rattling.
Mm-hmm.
All of those things are very high on Russia's national security concern list. And because of that, those are likely areas where Russia is using its intelligence services to collect. So that's what we should look at in the short term. In the long term, what Russian intelligence services will look like will be dependent on what Russia looks like. Does Russia change? Does Russia become hardened? Does Russia's invasion of Ukraine have long-term damage on the Russian state? All of those things are possible, and those then will have a direct effect on what Russian intelligence services look like in the future.
Kevin, again, thank you so much for your time today, sir.